We're in Staten Island at the wedding, and Brando, he gave out belts at the end, for championship belts for Mooney. He went for his belt, I went for my belt. And Coppola said, come on now, there are women and children, but he kept going, I kept going. We mooned each other, mooned everybody.
There are truths that can only be spoken when the price of silence becomes too high. In Hollywood, not everyone is allowed to speak the truth, and not everyone dares to do so. Robert Duvall understands this better than most. He harbors no public grudges, nor does he need to shock to survive in the media. That's why the moment he broke decades of silence to criticize Marlon Brando was particularly noteworthy. It was when respect for an icon was no longer enough to continue covering up the damage that an oversized ego had left behind. In Duvall's description, Brando was not a bad guy in the usual sense. He was someone who possessed an ego that did not accept equality. This mentality often appears in geniuses who are celebrated too early. When talent becomes proof that one is always right, all collective boundaries are seen as obstacles. For Brando, the creative space was not a place to build together, but a territory that needed to be absolutely controlled. Anyone who dims that spotlight, even unintentionally, is seen as a threat to be eliminated. What led Duvall to call Brando destructive was not his loud outbursts of anger, but his silent subversion. This is the mentality of someone who understands his power very well and uses it coldly. Brando didn't need to shout to dominate. He only needed to change the rhythm of the performance, disrupt the flow of emotion, or take over his co-stars with small but fatal details. Psychologically, this is a form of high-level control, where the perpetrator always maintains the appearance of a difficult genius, while the victim looks like someone who lacks the ability to adapt. Duvall's words were shocking, not only because they targeted Brando, but also because they shattered a myth Hollywood deliberately perpetuated, that great genius always comes with nobility. Psychologically, the industry needed untouchable icons to protect its own narrative. When Duvall called Brando out by name, he wasn't just talking about a person, but pointing to an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes what is called genius is actually a spoiled ego that destroys others and is tolerated by the entire system for profit and fame. For Marlon Brando, the film set was not simply a collective workspace, but a domain of the ego. This mentality formed when a person became too accustomed to having all boundaries broken down because of their talent. Brando entered each project with the implicit belief that he was the linchpin of the entire film. When another actor began to shine, his alarm system immediately activated. It wasn't because of superficial jealousy, but because of a deep-seated fear losing control meant losing status. And to avoid that, he forced the shared space to revolve around him. Brando rarely confronted people directly. He used a more subtle form of manipulation, disrupting the rhythm of others' performances. Changing lines, adding unnecessary gestures, or disrupting emotions at crucial moments was not random behavior, but a psychological tactic. It caused his co-stars to lose their bearings, doubting their own abilities, while Brando still appeared as the genius improviser. Psychologically, this is a manifestation of someone who constantly needs to assert their superiority and never accepts a balance of power. One of Brando's most frightening traits was his unpredictability. He didn't sabotage repetitively, but constantly changed tactics to keep others on their toes. This mentality often appears in individuals with a high need for control. When others don't know what will happen, they are forced to revolve around them. On a film set, this creates emotional dependency. Co-stars no longer focus on their roles, but on dealing with Brando. The question Duvall implicitly raises is not whether Brando was talented, but whether talent justifies hurting others. Brando's mentality reveals a dangerous line. When genius is deified, destructive behavior is disguised as creative personality. Hollywood not only tolerates this, but also celebrates it as a sign of greatness. And it is this mechanism that turns talent into a legitimate excuse for psychological violence, where the perpetrator remains unnamed while the victim is forced to remain silent to continue working. The most bitter lesson Robert Duvall learned did not come from professional failure, but from recognizing an unacceptable truth. There are people you cannot fix, cannot persuade, and cannot defeat with talent. Psychologically, this is an important shift from competitive thinking to self-preservation thinking. Duvall understood that trying to prove right or wrong with toxic egos only dragged him into a destructive spiral. From that moment on, he chose not to confront, but to opt out of the game. In Hollywood, where ego is often seen as a creative engine stepping back, is easily misinterpreted as defeat. But for Duvall, distancing himself from toxic people was a form of psychological discipline. He didn't cut ties in anger, nor did he make himself a victim. He simply withdrew his energy from relationships that didn't bring creative value. This mindset requires a high level of awareness, knowing how to distinguish between healthy professional conflict and personal sabotage. Duvall does not publicly criticize, retaliate, or expose. Instead, he builds a wall of silence around himself. Psychologically, this is a defense mechanism of someone who understands that power lies not in words, but in the ability to control one's own reactions. Duvall's silence is not passive endurance, but a way for him to keep his artistic identity from being defined by conflict. He refuses to let others write his story for him. After all, what Duvall learned was not how to become greater, but how to survive long-term in a system that indulges the ego. He understood that talent only develops sustainably when accompanied by clear boundaries. Staying away from toxic people did not diminish him. It helped him maintain his inner integrity, something many other geniuses have lost. And it is precisely that integrity that has been the foundation for Duvall to exist, work, and be respected for decades in an industry that is rarely tolerant of wholesomeness. For Robert Duvall, silence was never a fear of Hollywood power. It was a highly calculated psychological decision. He understood very well that in a system where narratives are controlled by reputation and power, those who speak out too soon often become labeled not by the truth they speak, but by the trouble they create. Therefore, Duvall chose to exist outside the whirlwind of public opinion, protecting his career by not allowing himself to be framed as a troublemaker. At a deeper level, Duvall's silence stems from a very human fear, the fear of being swallowed whole by a negative narrative. Psychologically, he does not want his professional life to be defined by conflicts with others, even if those conflicts are real. Silence helps him maintain control over his personal narrative, so that when people mention Robert Duvall, they think of his roles not behind-the-scenes conflicts. Duvall understands that the truth does not always hold equal value at all times. Speaking out too soon can ruin someone else's career, but it can also ruin one's own. This mindset reflects a rare form of moral responsibility in a fiercely competitive environment. He does not want his words to become weapons that cause harm, even though he himself has been hurt. Silence in this case is his way of delaying the truth until it no longer causes unnecessary harm. What makes Duvall's silence so mysterious is the moment he chooses to break it. Once he is on the other side of his career, when he no longer needs to protect his position or reputation, he allows himself to speak the things that were once locked away. Psychologically, this is the moment when a person has enough distance to look back without being overwhelmed by emotion. The question, what remains unsaid, is no longer a promise of drama, but a reminder that some truths are only safe to tell after time has run its course. The relationship between Robert Duvall and Dustin Hoffman did not begin with competition, but with shared circumstances. Two young men without fame shared cramped quarters, fragile dreams, and constant worries about the future. Psychologically, this was a friendship built on survival instinct, sharing hunger, seeking opportunities together, and believing that the person beside you was not an opponent, but an ally. That is why any betrayal later on, if there was one, was not just a professional wound, but the collapse of a primal trust. In the early stages, Duvall was completely unguarded. He shared his methods for practicing roles, voice, and rhythm as a natural habit among friends. But psychologically, not everyone receives sharing in the same way. For Hoffman, initial observation for learning gradually turned into gathering. The problem was not in learning from others, that is normal, but in no longer recognizing the moral boundary between absorption and appropriation. When that line disappears, the friendship begins to crack without any arguments. It is noteworthy that Duvall did not confront him immediately. Psychologically, this is the reaction of someone who senses something is negative but does not want to name it yet. He did not want to believe that his friend with whom he had shared everything could cross that line. The silence at this point is not a strategy, but a denial of emotion, a way of protecting oneself from the possibility of having to admit that a once genuine relationship is becoming distorted. It is this hesitation that allows the rift to silently widen. The friendship between Duvall and Hoffman does not end with a dramatic moment. It died slowly, amid an imbalance of power and differing views on success. Psychologically, Duvall saw his career as a process of accumulating and preserving his identity, while Hoffman became increasingly caught up in the need to assert himself at all costs. When two value systems no longer run parallel, silence becomes an unbridgeable gap, and that is perhaps the most painful form of breakup. No farewell, just the quiet withdrawal of someone who understands they no longer stand on the same moral ground. Initially, the signs that bothered Duvall appeared sporadically: a familiar acting voice, a method of role preparation recounted as someone else's personal experience. Psychologically, this is the stage where people often reassure themselves that everything is just a coincidence. But when the pieces repeat with sufficient frequency, doubt is no longer a vague feeling, but an undeniable realization. Duvall understood that what was happening was no longer a misunderstanding between friends, but a systematic blurring of personal boundaries. For an actor, voice and character-building methods are not just techniques, but extensions of identity. When Duvall felt those elements being used without acknowledgement, the hurt lay not in the wasted effort, but in the feeling of being robbed of ownership over himself. Psychologically, this is a form of injury difficult to put into words because it leaves no clear evidence. The wounded person is easily seen as sensitive or selfish if they speak up, which is precisely why Duvall remained silent for a while longer. The last straw came when Duvall realized that what had been shared privately was now publicly recounted as Hoffman's personal achievement. That moment needed no argument. Psychologically, Duvall came to a cold but decisive decision to cut ties to protect himself. He did not confront him and did not demand an apology, because he understood that when someone is accustomed to crossing boundaries without resistance, they rarely admit fault. Duvall's subsequent silence was no longer hesitant. It was final. Psychologically, this was a shift from hope to acceptance that the relationship was beyond repair and that any attempt at reconciliation would only prolong the hurt. Duvall did not leave in bitterness, but in lucidity. He chose to maintain his dignity by stepping out of the story, letting others continue to tell it their way, while he continued to do his job his way. Hollywood rarely destroys someone with a public scandal. Instead, power operates in unrecorded conversations and seemingly innocuous comments between directors and actors. When Duvall heard that he was being described as difficult to work with, he understood very well the danger of this label. Psychologically, it was a form of invisible attack. No evidence needed, no debate needed, just enough doubt sown to close the door of opportunity. A frightening feature of soft power is its self-amplifying nature. When a reputable person suggests that someone is difficult to work with, this information is quickly repeated as objective truth. Duvall realized that once a story leaves its source, it no longer belongs to anyone. Psychologically, this is the most helpless moment. The affected person doesn't know how to refute it because there are no specific accusations to counter. The natural human reflex to injustice is to refute it. But Duvall did not do that. Psychologically, he understood that reactions within the soft power system are often interpreted as confirming evidence. The more you defend yourself, the more uncooperative you appear. Instead of entering that game, he chose the opposite strategy: silence, hard work, and letting his results speak for themselves. It was a risky decision, but also the only way to avoid being drawn deeper into the web of manipulation. Duvall's story shows that the problem lies not only with one individual speaking ill, but with a system that is willing to believe the slander if it comes from someone with enough power. Hollywood tolerates this mechanism because it is effective and difficult to trace. Psychologically, the survivor is not the winner of the fight, but the one who understands when to retreat to preserve the ability to continue working. Duvall did not break the system, he learned to exist within it without losing himself. For Robert Duvall, professionalism was never a hollow moral slogan. It was a psychological strategy built on experience. He understood that in an environment of soft power where reputation spreads faster than truth, a stable image is the most valuable asset. Instead of expending energy proving he was treated unfairly, Duvall focused on maintaining the image of a reliable collaborator, someone who worked efficiently and appropriately and did not create problems for the system. Professionalism at a deeper level is the ability to control emotional reactions. Duvall does not allow personal resentment to seep into how he appears in public. Psychologically, this is an expression of inner power. When you do not let your emotions be triggered by the behavior of others, you are no longer easily manipulated. He understands that public anger may bring short-term relief, but the price is control over the narrative. Duvall continues to work steadily, accepting roles, appearing appropriately at events, and even speaking well of colleagues when asked. Psychologically, it is a silent statement: I am not defined by conflict. In an industry where personal image determines opportunity, stability became the most convincing proof of competence. He didn't need to justify himself. His persistence alone refuted the backstage whispers. However, professionalism also came at a price. Psychologically, constantly suppressing personal reactions required great endurance. Duvall accepted the trade-off of speaking out to preserve his long-term creative space. It is this accumulation that explains why, in his twilight years, he finally allowed himself to speak truthfully. Not to rewrite the past, but to release the emotions that had been locked away for too long in the professional shell he had built for himself. To audiences, Robert Duvall and James Caan embodied brotherhood in The Godfather. The relationship between Tom Hagen and Sonny Corleone was so convincing that it led to an unconscious belief if they could act like that, they must be close in real life. Psychologically, audiences often equate on-screen chemistry with real-life bonding. Hollywood understands this mechanism very well and does not hesitate to nurture it. The reality behind the scenes is much more complicated. Between Duvall and Caan, there was no fierce hatred, but rather a silent rivalry, the most dangerous kind of conflict, because it is never spoken of. Psychologically, both were strong, self-respecting men keenly aware of their positions in an iconic film. When the spotlight fell more on one than the other, an imbalance began to form, though neither publicly acknowledged it. What makes this relationship difficult to recognize is how both maintain perfect civility in public. They laugh, joke, share behind-the-scenes stories, and appear together at reunions. Psychologically, this is a kind of tacit agreement. Neither allows personal ego to destroy something greater, the legacy of the film. But that very control meant the real distance was never addressed, only masked by appearances. Duvall looks back on his relationship with Khan, not with bitterness, but with belated understanding. He realized that sometimes preserving a great work requires very human sacrifices, accepting to play a role in real life to protect the shared story. Psychologically, this is a painful maturation, understanding that not every relationship needs to be saved, but every legacy needs to be protected. And it is that choice that has helped keep The Godfather standing as an icon despite the cracks behind the lights. Hollywood loves to tell stories about genius, friendship, and harmony, but what Robert Duvall hints at is a harder truth to swallow. Many masterpieces are born not through consensus, but through artists' ability to suppress their egos long enough to complete the work. Psychologically, this is a profound paradox. Great art often emerges in tense environments where personal emotions are suppressed to make way for a greater goal. For Duvall, protecting a legacy doesn't mean denying the pain. It means not letting that pain become the center of the story. Psychologically, he accepts sacrificing his right to speak out in the heat of the moment, to keep the work from being dragged into a whirlwind of controversy. It's a harsh choice, placing the value of art above one's own need to be understood. Films like The Godfather exist not only because of talent, but also because of countless uncredited compromises. Duvall represents a class of artists who understand that perfection on screen is often bought with imperfection in real life. Psychologically, this is the ability to separate oneself from one's personal role to serve a larger structure. Not everyone can do that without losing themselves. Only when the legacy was solid enough did Duvall allow himself to speak out. Not to topple the monument, but to complete the picture. Psychologically, this is the act of closing a cycle from silence for survival to speaking out for liberation. He doesn't ask the audience to choose sides, only invites them to look squarely at the truth that great art is sometimes built from very imperfect people. And it is precisely that imperfection, when viewed honestly, that makes the legacy complete. Hollywood likes to be seen as a place of light red carpets, golden statues, and immortal moments on screen. But Robert Duvall's story reminds us that beneath that light is a different foundation built on silence, endurance, and delayed truths. Talent brings people to Hollywood, but it is rarely enough to keep them there. Broken relationships, unchecked egos, and unnamed battles are part of the fabric of this industry. Psychologically, survival doesn't belong to the loudest voice, but to the one who understands when to advance and when to retreat. Duvall didn't become a legend because he won every conflict, but because he knew not to let conflict define him. The truth in Hollywood doesn't disappear when it's hidden. It just waits for a safe moment to be spoken. When Robert Duvall finally spoke up, it wasn't an act of idle toppling, but a completion. He gave back to film history a more complete picture, one where genius and darkness coexist, neither denying the other. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson. Hollywood is not built on glamour, but on people who accept sacrifice, swallow the truth, and continue their craft. When the lights go out, what remains is not fame, but how people choose to survive in that world.